Book 4, Part 3 of the Histories by Publius Cornelius Tacitus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Histories by Publius Cornelius Tacitus, translated by Alfred John Church and William Jackson Brodribb. Book 4, January to November, A.D. 70, Part 3. These men, headstrong, cowardly, and spiritless, as a mob without a leader always is, on the approach of Civilis, hastily took up arms, and, as hastily abandoning them, betook themselves to flight. Disaster produced disunion, the troops from the upper army disassociating their cause from that of their comrades. Nevertheless, the statues of Vitellius were again set up in the camp and in the neighboring Belgian towns, and this at a time when Vitellius himself had fallen. Then the men of the 1st, the 4th, and the 18th legions, repenting of their conduct, followed Vocula, and again taking in his presence the oath of allegiance to Vespasian, were marched by him to the relief of Mogontiacum. The besieging army, an heterogeneous mass of Chatti, Usipii, and Mattiaci, had raised the siege, glutted with spoils, but not without suffering loss. Our troops attacked them on the way, dispersed and unprepared. Moreover, the Treveri had constructed a breastwork and rampart across their territory, and they and the Germans continued to contend with great losses on both sides up to the time when they tarnished by rebellion their distinguished services to the Roman people. Meanwhile Vespasian, now consul for the 2nd time, and Titus entered upon their office, both being absent from Rome. People were gloomy and anxious under the pressure of manifold fears, for, over and above immediate perils, they had taken groundless alarm under the impression that Africa was in rebellion through the revolutionary movements of Lucius Piso. He was the governor of that province, and was far from being a man of turbulent disposition. The fact was that the wheat ships were detained by the severity of the weather, and the lower orders, who were accustomed to buy their provisions from day to day, and to whom cheap corn was the sole subject of public interest, feared and believed that the ports had been closed and the supplies stopped, the Vitellianists, who had not given up their party feelings, helping to spread the report, which was not displeasing even to the conquerors. Their ambition, which even foreign campaigns could not fill to the full, was not satisfied by any triumphs that civil war could furnish. On the 1st of January, at a meeting of the Senate, convoked for the purpose by Julius Frontinus, praetor of the city, votes of thanks were passed to the legates, to the armies, and to the allied kings. The office of praetor was taken away from Tetius Julianus, as having deserted his legion when it passed over to the party of Vespasian, with a view to its being transferred to Plotius Griffus. Equestrian rank was conferred on Hormus. Then, on the resignation of Frontinus, Caesar Domitian assumed the office of praetor of the city. His name was put at the head of despatches and edicts, but the real authority was in the hands of Mucianus, with this exception, that Domitian ventured on several acts of power, at the instigation of his friends, or at his own caprice. But Mucianus found his principal cause of apprehension in Primus Antonius and Varus Arius, who, in the freshness of their fame, while distinguished by great achievements and by the attachment of the soldiery, were also supported by the people, who in no case had they extended their severities beyond the battlefield, had urged Scribonianus Crassus, whom an illustrious descent added to the honors of his brother made a conspicuous person, to assume the supreme power, and it was understood that a number of accomplices would not have failed to support him had not the proposal been rejected by Scribonianus, who was a man not easily to be tempted even by a certainty, and was proportionately apprehensive of risk. Mucianus, seeing that Antonius could not be openly crushed, heaped many praises upon him in the Senate, and loaded him with promises in secret, holding out as a prize the government of eastern Spain, then vacant in consequence of the departure of Cluvius Rufus. At the same time he lavished on his friends tribuneships and praefectures. And then, when he had filled the vain heart of the man with hope and ambition, he destroyed his power by sending into winter quarters the 7th legion, whose affection for Antonius was particularly vehement. The 3rd legion, old troops of Varius Arus, were sent back to Syria. Part of the army was on its way to Germany. Thus, all elements of disturbance being removed, the usual appearance of the capital, the laws, and the jurisdiction of the magistrates were once more restored. Domitian, on the day of his taking his seat in the Senate, made a brief and measured speech in reference to the absence of his father and brother, and to his own youth. He was graceful in his bearing, and, his real character being yet unknown, the frequent blush of his countenance passed for modesty. On his proposing the restoration of the imperial honors of Galba, Curtius Montanus moved that respect should also be paid to the memory of Piso. The Senate passed both motions, but that which referred to Piso was not carried out. Certain commissioners were then appointed by lot, who were to see to the restitution of property plundered during the war, to examine and restore to their place the brazen tables of the laws, which had fallen down through age, to free the calendar from the additions which the adulatory spirit of the time had disfigured it, and to put a check on the public expenditure. The office of praetor was restored to Tetius Julianus, as soon as it was known that he had fled for refuge to Vespasian. Griffus still retained his rank. It was then determined that the cause of Musonius Rufus against Publius Celer should again be brought on. Publius was condemned, and thus expiation was made to the shade of Soranus. The day thus marked by an example of public justice was not barren of distinction to individuals. Musonius was thought to have fulfilled the righteous duty of an accuser, but men spoke very differently of Demetrius, a disciple of the cynical school of philosophy, who pleaded the cause of a notorious criminal by appeals to corrupt influences rather than by fair argument. Publius himself, in his peril, had neither spirit nor power of speech left. The signal for vengeance on informers having been thus given, Junius Mauricus had asked Caesar to give the Senate access to the imperial registers, from which they might learn what impeachments the several informers had proposed. Caesar answered that in a matter of such importance the emperor must be consulted. The Senate, led by its principal members, then framed a form of oath, which was eagerly taken by all the magistrates and by the other senators in the order in which they voted. They called the gods to witness that nothing had been done by their instrumentality to prejudice the safety of any person, and that they had gained no distinction or advantage by the ruin of Roman citizens. Great was the alarm, and various the devices for altering the words of the oath, among those who felt the consciousness of guilt. The Senate appreciated the scruple, but denounced the perjury. This public censure, as it might be called, fell with especial severity on 3 men, Sariolanus Vocula, Nonius Attianus, and Caestius Severus, all of them infamous for having practiced the trade of the informer in the days of Nero. Sariolanus indeed labored under an imputation of recent date. It was said that he had attempted the same practices during the reign of Vitellius. The senators did not desist from threatening gestures till he quitted the chamber. Then, passing to Pacius Africanus, they assailed him in the same way. It was he, they said, who had singled out as victims for Nero the brothers Scribonius, renowned for their mutual affection and for their wealth. Africanus dared not confess his guilt, and could not deny it, but he himself turned to Vibius Crispus, who was pressing him with questions, and complicating a charge which he could not rebut, shifted the blame from himself by associating another with his guilt. Great was the reputation for brotherly affection as well as for eloquence which Vipstanius Messala earned for himself on that day, by venturing, though not yet of senatorial age, to plead for his brother Aquilius Regulus. The fall of the families of the Crassi and Orfitus had brought Regulus into the utmost odium. Of his own free will, as it seemed, and while still a mere youth, he had undertaken the prosecution, not to ward off any peril from himself, but in the hope of gaining power. The wife of Crassus, Sulpicia Praetextata, and her 4 children were ready, should the Senate take cognizance of the cause, to demand vengeance. Accordingly Messala, without attempting to defend the case or the person accused, had simply thrown himself in the way of the perils that threatened his brother, and had thus wrought upon the feelings of several senators. On this, Curtius Montanus met him with a fierce speech, in which he went to the length of asserting that after the death of Galba, money had been given by Regulus to the murderer of Piso, and that he had even fastened his teeth in the murdered man's head. Certainly, he said, Nero did not compel this act. You did not secure by this piece of barbarity either your rank or your life. We may bear with the defense put forward by men who thought it better to destroy others than to come into peril themselves. As for you, the exile of your father and the division of his property among his creditors had left you perfectly safe. Besides that your youth incapacitated you for office, there was nothing in you which Nero could either covet or dread. It was from sheer lust of slaughter and greed of gain that you, unknown as you were, you, who had never pleaded in any man's defense, steeped your soul in noble blood, when, though you had snatched from the very grave of your country the spoils of a man of consular rank, had been fed to the full with 7,000,000 sesterces, and shone with all the sacerdotal honors, you yet overwhelmed in one common ruin innocent boys, old men of illustrious name, and noble ladies, when you actually blamed the tardy movements of Nero in wearying himself and his informers with the overthrow of single families, and declared that the whole senate might be destroyed by one word. Keep, conscript fathers, preserve a man of such ready counsels, that every age may be furnished with his teacher, and that our young men may imitate Regulus, just as our old men imitate Marcellus and Crispus. Even unsuccessful villainy finds some to emulate it. What will happen if it flourish and be strong? And the man whom we dare not offend when he holds only the quaestor's rank, are we to see him rise to the dignity of praetor and consul? Do you suppose that Nero will be the last of the tyrants? Those who survived Tiberius, those who survived Caligula, thought the same. Yet after each there arose another ruler, yet more detestable and more cruel. We are not afraid of Vespasian. The age and moderation of the new emperor reassure us. But the influence of an example outlives the individual character. We have lost our vigor, conscript fathers. We are no longer the Senate, which, when Nero had fallen, demanded that the informers and ministers of the tyrant should be punished according to ancient custom. The first day after the downfall of a wicked emperor is the best of opportunities. Montanus was heard with such approval on the part of the Senate that Helvidius conceived a hope that Marcellus also might be overthrown. He therefore began with the panegyric on Cluvius Rufus, who, though not less rich nor less renowned for eloquence, had never imperiled a single life in the days of Nero. By this comparison, as well as by direct accusations, he pressed Appius hard, and stirred the indignation of the senators. When Marcellus perceived this, he made as if he would leave the house, exclaiming, "We go, Priscus, and leave you your senate. Act the king, though Caesar himself be present." Crispus followed. Both were enraged, but their looks were different. Marcellus cast furious glances about him, while Crispus smiled. They were drawn back, however, into the senate by the hasty interference of friends. The contest grew fiercer, while the well-disposed majority on the one hand, and the powerful minority on the other, fought out their obstinate quarrel, and thus the day was spent in altercation. At the next meeting of the Senate, Caesar began by recommending that the wrongs, the resentments, and the terrible necessities of former times should be forgotten, and Mucianus spoke at great length in favor of the informers. At the same time he admonished in gentle terms and in a tone of entreaty those who were reviving indictments, which they had before commenced and afterwards dropped. The senators, when they found themselves opposed, relinquished the liberty which they had begun to exercise. That it might not be thought that the opinion of the senate was disregarded, or that impunity was accorded to all acts done in the days of Nero, Mucianus sent back to their islands 2 men of senatorial rank, Octavius Sagita and Antistius Socianus, who had quitted their places of banishment. Octavius had seduced one Pontia Postuma, and on her refusing to marry him, in the frenzy of passion had murdered her. Socianus, in his depravity, had brought many to ruin. Both had been condemned and banished by a solemn decision of the senate, and though others were permitted to return, were kept under the same penalty. But this did not mitigate the hatred felt against Mucianus. Socianus and Sagita were utterly insignificant, even if they did return, but men dreaded the abilities of the informers, their wealth, and the power which they exercised in many sinister ways. A trial, conducted in the senate according to ancient precedents, brought into harmony for a time the feelings of its members. Manlius Patruitus, a senator, laid a complaint that he had been beaten by a mob in the colony of Sena, and that by the order of the magistrates; that the wrong had not stopped here, but that lamentations and wailings, in fact a representation of funeral obsequies, had been enacted in his presence, accompanied with contemptuous and insulting expressions levelled against the whole senate. The persons accused were summoned to appear, and after the case had been investigated, punishment was inflicted on those who were found guilty. A resolution of the senate was also passed, recommending more orderly behavior to the people of Sena. About the same time Antonius Flamma was condemned under the law against extortion, at the suit of the people of Cyrene, and was banished for cruel practices. Amidst all this, a mutiny in the army all but broke out. The troops who, having been disbanded by Vitellius, had flocked to support Vespasian, asked leave to serve again in the praetorian guard, and the soldiers who had been selected from the legions with the same prospect now clamored for their promised pay. Even the Vitellianists could not be got rid of without much bloodshed, but the money required for retaining in the service so vast a body of men was immensely large. Mucianus entered the camp to examine more accurately the individual claims. The victorious army wearing their proper decorations and arms, he drew up with moderate intervals of space between the divisions. Then the Vitellianists, whose capitulation at Bovillae I have already related, and the other troops of the party, who had been collected from the capital and its neighbourhood, were brought forth almost naked. Mucianus ordered these men to be drawn up apart, making the British, the German, and any other troops who were belonging to other armies take up separate positions. The very first view of their situation paralyzed them. They saw opposed to them what seemed an hostile array, threatening them with javelin and sword. They saw themselves hemmed in, without arms, filthy and squalid. And when they began to be separated, some to be marched to one spot, and some to another, a thrill of terror ran through them all. Among the troops from Germany the panic was particularly great, for they believed that this separation marked them out for slaughter. They embraced their fellow soldiers, clung to their necks, begged for parting kisses, and entreated that they might not be deserted, or doomed in a common cause to suffer a different lot. They invoked now Mucianus, now the absent emperor, and, as a last resource, heaven and the gods, till Mucianus came forward, and calling them soldiers bound by the same oath and the servants of the same emperor, stopped the groundless panic. And indeed the victorious army seconded the tears of the vanquished with their approving shouts. This terminated the proceedings for the day. But when Domitian harangued them a few days afterwards, they received him with increased confidence. The land that was offered them they contemptuously rejected, and begged for regular service and pay. Theirs were prayers indeed, but such as it was impossible to reject. They were therefore received into the praetorian camp. Then such as had reached the prescribed age, or had served the proper number of campaigns, received an honorable discharge. Others were dismissed for misconduct, but this was done by degrees and in detail, always the safest mode of reducing the united strength of a multitude. It is a fact that, whether suggested by real poverty or by a wish to give the appearance of it, a proposition passed the Senate to the effect that a loan of 60,000,000 sesterces from private persons should be accepted. Pompeius Silvanus was appointed to manage the affair. Before long, either the necessity ceased or the pretense was dropped. After this, on the motion of Domitian, the consulships conferred by Vitellius were cancelled, and the honors of a censor's funeral were paid to Sabinus. Great lessons, both of the mutability of fortune, ever bringing together the highest honors and the lowest humiliations. About the same time the proconsul Lucius Piso was murdered. I shall make the account of this murder as exact as possible by first reviewing a few earlier circumstances which have a bearing on the origin and motives of such deeds. The legion and the auxiliaries stationed in Africa to guard the frontiers of the empire were under the proconsul's authority during the reigns of the divine Augustus and Tiberius. But in the course of time Caligula, prompted by his restless temper and by his fear of Marcus Silanus, who then held Africa, took away the legion from the proconsul and handed it over to a legate whom he had sent for that purpose. The patronage was equally divided between the two officers. A source of disagreement was thus studiously sought in the continual clashing of their authority, and it was further developed by an unprincipled rivalry. The power of the legates grew through their lengthened tenure of office, and perhaps because an inferior feels greater interest in such a competition. All the more distinguished of the proconsuls cared more for security than for power. At this time the legion in Africa was commanded by Valerius Festus, a young man of extravagant habits and immoderate ambition, who was now made uneasy by his relationship to Vitellius. Whether this man in their frequent interviews tempted Piso to revolt, or whether he resisted such overtures is not known for certain, for no one was present at their confidential meetings, and, after Piso's death, many were disposed to ingratiate themselves with the murderer. There is no doubt that the province and the troops entertained feelings of hostility to Vespasian, and some of the Vitellianists, who had escaped from the capital, incessantly represented to Piso that Gaul was hesitating and Germany ready to revolt, that his own position was perilous, and that for one who in peace must be suspected, war was the safer course. While this was going on, Claudius Sagita, praefect of Petra's horse, making a very quick passage, reached Africa before Papirius, the centurion dispatched by Mucianus. He declared that an order to put Piso to death had been given to the centurion, and that Galerianus, his cousin and son-in-law, had perished, that his only hope of safety was in bold action, that in such action two paths were open: he might defend himself on the spot, or he might sail for Gaul and offer his services as general to the Vitellianist armies. Piso was wholly unmoved by this statement. The centurion dispatched by Mucianus, on landing in the port of Carthage, raised his voice, and invoked in succession all the blessings on the head of Piso, as if he were emperor, and bade the bystanders, who were astonished by this sudden and strange proceeding, take up the same cry. The credulous mob rushed into the marketplace, and demanded that Piso should show himself. They threw everything into uproar with their clamorous shouts of joy, careless of the truth and only eager to flatter. Piso, acting on the information of Sagita, or perhaps from natural modesty, would not make his appearance in public, or trust himself to the zeal of the populace. On questioning the centurion, and finding that he had sought a pretext for accusing and murdering him, he ordered the man to be executed, moved not so much by any hope of saving his life as by indignation against the assassin, for this fellow had been one of the murderers of Macer, and now had come to slay the proconsul with hands already stained with the blood of the legate. He then severely blamed the people of Carthage in an edict which betrayed his anxiety, and ceased to discharge even the usual duties of his office. shutting himself up in his palace to guard against any casual occurrence which might lead to a new outbreak. But when the agitation of the people, the execution of the centurion, and other news, true or false, exaggerated as usual by report, came to the ears of Festus, he sent some cavalry to put Piso to death. They rode over at full speed, and broke into the dwelling of the proconsul in the dim light of early dawn, with their swords drawn in their hands. Many of them were unacquainted with the person of Piso, for the legate had selected some Moorish and Carthaginian auxiliaries to perpetrate the deed. Near the proconsul's chamber they chanced to meet a slave, and asked him who he was, and where Piso was to be found. The slave, with a noble untruth, replied, "I am he," and was immediately cut down. Soon after Piso was killed, for there was on the spot one who recognized him, Baebius Massa, one of the procurators of Africa, a name even then fatal to the good, and destined often to reappear among the causes of the sufferings which he had ere long to endure. From Adrumentum, where he had stayed to watch the result, Festus went to the legion, and gave orders that Catronius Pisanus, prefect of the camp, should be put in irons. He did this out of private pique, but called the man an accomplice of Piso. Some few centurions and soldiers he punished, others he rewarded, neither the one nor the other deservedly, but he wished men to believe that he had extinguished a war. He then put an end to the quarrel between the Censis and the Lepidani, which, originating in robberies of corn and cattle on two rustic populations, had grown from this insignificant beginning till it was carried on in pitched battles. The people of Caii, who were inferior in numbers, had summoned to their aid the Garamantes, a wild race incessantly occupied in robbing their neighbors. This had brought the Lepidani to extremities. Their territory had been ravaged far and wide, and they were trembling within their walls, when the Garamantes were put to flight by the arrival of the auxiliary infantry and cavalry, and the whole of the booty was recaptured, with the exception of some which the plunderers, in their wanderings through inaccessible hamlets, had sold to more distant tribes. Vespasian had heard of the victory of Cremona, and had received favorable tidings from all quarters, and he was now informed of the fall of Vitellius by many persons of every rank, who, with a good fortune equal to their courage, risked the perils of the wintry sea. Envoys had come from King Vologesus to offer him 40,000 Parthian cavalry. It was a matter of pride and joy to him to be courted with such splendid offers of help from the allies, and not to want them. He thanked Vologesus, and recommended him to send ambassadors to the Senate, and to learn for himself that peace had been restored. While his thoughts were fixed on Italy and on the state of the capital, he heard an unfavorable account of Domitian, which represented him as overstepping the limits of his age and the privileges of a son. He therefore entrusted Titus with the main strength of the army to complete what had yet to be done in the Jewish war. It was said that Titus, before his departure, had a long interview with his father, in which he implored him not to let himself be easily excited by the reports of slanderers, but to show an impartial and forgiving temper towards his son. Legions and fleets, he reminded him, are not such sure bulwarks of imperial power as a numerous family. As for friends, time, altered fortunes, perhaps their passions or their errors may weaken, may change, may even destroy their affection. A man's own race can never be disassociated from him, least of all with princes, whose prosperity is shared by others, while their reverses touch but their nearest kin. Even between brothers there can be no lasting affection, except the father sets the example. Vespasian, delighted with the brotherly affection of Titus, rather than reconciled to Domitian, bade his son to be of good cheer, and aggrandize the state by wars and deeds of arms. He would himself provide for the interests of the peace, and for the welfare of his family. He then had some of the swiftest vessels laden with corn, and committed them to the perils of the still, stormy sea. Rome indeed was in the very critical position of not having more than 10 days' consumption in the granaries, when the supplies from Vespasian arrived. the work of rebuilding the Capitol was assigned by him to Lucius Vestinius, a man of the equestrian order, who, however, for high character and reputation, ranked among the nobles. The soothsayers whom he assembled directed that the remains of the old shrine should be removed to the marshes, and the new temple raised on the original site. The gods, they said, forbade the old form to be changed. On the 21st of June, beneath a cloudless sky, the entire space devoted to the sacred enclosure was encompassed with chaplets and garlands. Soldiers who bore auspicious names entered the precincts with sacred bows. Then the Vestal Virgins, with a troop of boys and girls, whose fathers and mothers were still living, sprinkled the whole space with water drawn from the fountains and rivers. After this, Helvidius Priscus, the praetor, first purified the spot with the usual sacrifice of a sow, a sheep, and a bull, and duly placed the entrails on turf. Then, in terms dictated by Publius Aelianus, the high priest, besought Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, and the tutelar deities of the place, to prosper the undertaking, and to lend their divine help to raise the abodes which the piety of men had founded for them. He then touched the wreaths which were wound round the foundation stone, and entwined with the ropes, while at the same moment all the other magistrates of the state, the priests, the senators, the knights, and a number of the citizens, with zeal and joy uniting their efforts, dragged the huge stone along. Contributions of gold and silver and virgin ores, never smelted in the furnace, but still in their natural state, were showered on the foundations. The soothsayers had previously directed that no stone or gold which had been intended for any other purpose should profane the work. Additional height was given to the structure. This was the only variation which religion would permit, and the one feature which had been thought wanting in the splendor of the old temple. Meanwhile, the tidings of the death of Vitellius, spreading through Gaul and Germany, had caused a second war. Civilis had thrown aside all disguise, and was now openly assailing the Roman power, while the legions of Vitellius preferred even a foreign yoke to the rule of Vespasian. Gaul had gathered fresh courage from the belief that the fortunes of our armies had been everywhere disastrous, for a report was rife that our winter camps in Moesia and Pannonia were hemmed in by the Sarmatians and Dacians. Rumors equally false were circulated respecting Britain. Above all, the conflagration of the Capitol had made them believe that the end of the Roman Empire was at hand. The Gauls, they remember, had captured the city in former days, but as the abode of Jupiter was uninjured, the empire had survived, whereas now the Druids declared, with the prophetic utterances of an idle superstition, that this fatal conflagration was a sign of the anger of heaven, and portended universal empire for the Transalpine nations. A rumor had also gone forth that the chiefs of Gaul, whom Otho had sent against Vitellius, had, before their departure, bound themselves by a compact not to fail the cause of freedom, should the power of Rome be broken by a continuous succession of civil wars and internal calamities. End of Book 4, Part 3.